time to the Lord. Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you for these last several weeks as we've been looking at some of the leading ladies of the Bible as we conclude today looking at Esther and the amazing story of what she went through, the lessons that we can learn from it, Lord, and that we would leave here today challenged perhaps in ways that we haven't been before, that we might live our lives for you and become more like your Son, the Lord Jesus. We ask it in his name. Amen. Now, I know this might be dating me, but how many of you remember the TV program Queen for a Day? Oh, more than I thought. Oh, that's good. Well, for those of you too young to remember, Queen for a Day was a weekly TV program that ran from 1956 to 1964. And each week, several women from the audience would be selected as contestants and then asked questions as to why she should be queen. And very often there were very, not sob stories, but real sad things. They had medical bills or they had problems, their house burned down and so on. Then at the end of the program, one of the ladies would be selected to be queen for a day. And among other prizes, including helping to meet the need that she had, her hair was done by a famous Hollywood makeup artist, and she dined at a world-famous restaurant. It was a great show, and that's why it lasted as long as it did. Well, Queen for a Day went off the air years ago, but nowadays we've moved on to, you could call it Queen for a Year, which is the annual Miss America pageant. That's where young women from all 50 states in the District of Columbia gather together in Atlantic City to represent their particular state while displaying their talent and their intellect and their beauty. The contestants are then narrowed down to one lucky lady who is selected to be Miss America for the entire year. And her reign begins, as you know, it used to be Burt Parks, but now it's a different MC every year. He presents her to the crowd and he sings, "There she is, Miss," and she comes with her roses and her sash and so on. Well, when you read the first 2 chapters of the book of Esther, and I know you all did, you might find yourself asking, where's the MC? And when is he going to sing, "There she is, the new Miss Persia"? And you'd say that because the MC seems to be about the only thing that's missing in these chapters. You see, in a very real sense, the book of Esther begins as a beauty pageant. And with such a beginning, you'd think that the whole story would continue in that vein. However, we need to understand that the book of Esther isn't a fairy tale, not by any means, nor is it a work of fiction. Instead, the book of Esther describes actual events that took place when the people of Israel were in captivity during the reign of King Xerxes, who ruled over the Persian Empire from 485 to 465 BC. And Esther's story opens in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign. Now, we should take note of the fact that Xerxes was a king of immense power. In fact, at this particular point in history, no one on earth was as powerful as King Xerxes, the king of Persia. His kingdom was divided into 127 provinces that extended all the way from modern-day Turkey down to Africa and even into parts of northern India. And he ruled this vast empire from his capital city of Susa, which was located in what is now modern-day Iran. Now, the first chapter of Esther begins with Xerxes hosting a banquet. And what a banquet it was. Believe it or not, it lasted, are you ready for this? It lasted for 6 months. That's a party. And all the nobles and officials and military leaders of the empire were there. And verse 4 of chapter 1 tells us that the purpose of this lengthy party was to, quote, display the vast wealth of Xerxes' kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. It sounds like God, doesn't it? Now, Xerxes probably did this in order to impress the leaders of those 127 provinces so they'd have enough confidence in him to support his upcoming invasion of Greece, which was about the only part of the known world that Xerxes didn't control. Well, not long after that 6-month banquet, he decided to have another bash, but this one lasted only 7 days. That's a shorty, right? 7 days, a week-long party. And according to verse 5 of chapter 1, everyone was invited, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The celebration in Xerxes' palace had everyone sitting on gold and silver couches in a garden decorated with blue and white linen, fastened with silver rings on marble pillars. The floor of the room was made of marble inlaid with mother of pearl and other costly stones, and wine was served in golden goblets, each one custom made for the banquet. And everyone was allowed to drink as much wine as they wanted. Apparently there was no designated driver at these parties. You don't want to take your chariot home and be... Anyways, based on what we're told in this chapter, Xerxes had essentially turned his palace into a sort of fraternity house. In fact, the Greek version of the Old Testament actually calls this a drinking party. And Xerxes' purpose in all this was fourfold. Number one, to make himself look good. What king wouldn't? Number two, to impress his subjects with his power. Number three, to make his soldiers proud. And number four, to make his enemies, especially the Greeks, afraid. Well, verse 10 says that on the last day of this drinking party, when the king was in high spirits from the wine, in other words, when he was drunk, he ordered his servants to bring in his queen, Queen Vashti, so that all his guests could gaze at her beauty. And again, his motive in all this was to impress everyone. Remember, he'd been showing off all of his prized possessions, his goblets and his tapestries and his palace, and now he wanted to show off his ultimate possession, his lovely queen Vashti, whose name just happens to mean beautiful woman. Well, verse 11 says that Xerxes instructed Vashti to appear before this inebriated party guests wearing her royal crown. But the way it's worded in the text has led many scholars, especially Jewish scholars, to think that this meant that that's all she was to wear. Now, there's no way to know for sure, but if that were the case, then such an order would not only be a gross breach of Persian etiquette, but a cruel outrage, which would have disgraced Vashti for life. So she refused. And her refusal was not only courageous, it was fully justified. However, refusing to obey the king, as you might imagine, especially in front of his guests and at the height of Miller time, caused Xerxes to become outraged. In fact, look at verse 12. The king became furious and burned with anger because Vashti had embarrassed him in front of his subjects. You see, she made him look weak at a moment when he wanted to look strong. And that simply would not do. So what did he do? He consulted his wise men to get their ruling on this particular matter. It was sort of like taking the issue to the Supreme Court of his day. And their ruling reminds me of some of the rulings that courts in our land have come down with, because instead of complimenting Vashti for her morals, they actually recommended that she be punished for her morals. They also warned Xerxes that Vashti's attitude might catch on. And so unless she was severely punished, other wives might start standing up to their husbands, and they couldn't have that. And so they advised Xerxes to issue a royal decree which was to be written into the laws of the Medes and the Persians with no possibility of repeal. That was the key. When anything that was written into the Medes or the laws and the Persians, it could not be revoked. And what was the punishment? Was she was to be removed as queen, forbidding her to ever again enter into the king's presence. Now, everything we've just described took place in chapter 1. But between chapter 1 and chapter 2, 4 years have now passed, during which time Xerxes made a disastrous attempt to conquer Greece. In fact, he returned home to Susa in utter disgrace. Now just picture it. Xerxes enters the tall, gilded doors of his palace, weary from battle and dispirited by defeat. Not surprisingly, he longs for someone to greet him with arms outstretched, someone who would offer him words of comfort and encouragement. Not just a servant or one of his officers who was eager to please him, but someone who truly cared for him. Someone who understood his feelings. He'd long since forgotten his anger at Vashti, and now he remembered only her beauty and the warmth of her arms and the comfort of her understanding. But alas, the unchangeable law of the Medes and the Persians had been issued, and Xerxes had no queen. Well, his personal attendants noticed how depressed he was, and they advised that he find a new queen. But not just any queen. They thought Xerxes should have a real looker. So they said in chapter 2, verse 2, "Let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king." And they proposed that girls be chosen from each of those 127 provinces, and then they would parade in front of the king, who would then select his new queen based on her physical beauty. Now, I love the way verse 4 records the king's response to this suggestion. Look what it says. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. Appealed to the king. Well, why wouldn't it appeal to the king? I mean, he was going to be hosting the first Miss Universe contest, and he'd get to take the winner home with him. So no one was surprised when this contest was arranged. Now, one of the girls who was drafted into this beauty contest was a young Jewish girl by the name of Hadassah, but she was also known as Esther. We're told that she had been adopted and raised by her much older cousin Mordecai, and as we read in verse 7, she was lovely in form and feature. Well, along with several others, Esther made it past the preliminaries and into the final round of the contest. But before Esther and the other finalists went before the king, they had to undergo some very impressive beauty treatments. Now, let me pause here for a moment and let me do a quick survey of these single females who are here. You don't have to raise your hand or answer in any way, but Just think about how long does it take you to get ready for a date? I mean, including showering and hair and makeup and wardrobe and so on. 45 minutes? An hour? Anyone spend more time getting ready for the date than you actually spend on the date itself? Well, look at the prep time that Esther went through. Chapter 2, verse 12 says, before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women, 6 months with oil and myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. 1 whole year getting ready. That's a lot of oil of Olay. Well, after this year of preparation, each girl went before the king. And after totaling up all the points, sure enough, Esther was the winner. Verse 17 says, now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Meanwhile, Esther's cousin Mordecai, who had apparently, he had adopted her basically, he had apparently followed her to the palace and ended up getting a position at the king's gate, a position of considerable honor. Well, one day while Mordecai was at work, he overheard 2 officers who were conspiring to assassinate the king. So Mordecai told Esther, who in turn reported it to Xerxes. But Esther made sure that Mordecai got the credit. Well, as a result of this foiled plot, we read in verse 23, and when the report was investigated and found to be true, the 2 officials were hanged on a gallows. All this was recorded in the book of the annals of the presence of the king. Now we need to understand that in those days, a gallows were not like they are today, where people are hung by a rope. No, a gallows back then was either a tree or this large wooden stake on which prisoners were impaled. And before the story is over, we're going to hear about the gallows again. So that's chapter 2. Now, as chapter 3 opens, we're told that for some reason, Xerxes had decided to honor a very evil man by the name of Haman the Agagite, and elevated him to a position higher than that of any other noble, making him second only to Xerxes himself. But we need to take note of the fact that Haman was an Agagite. And the Agagites were a group of people who had held a grudge against the Jewish people for over 500 years, going all the way back to the time of Samuel. In fact, you might remember the incident in 1 Samuel chapter 15. That's where God told Samuel to kill all of the Amalekites along with all of their animals because they had attacked Israel shortly after they had left Egypt during the Exodus. But Saul, being the pragmatist that he was, he decided to save some of the best of the enemy's sheep. Remember, what is all this bleating that I hear, said Samuel. He also decided to spare the king of the Amalekites, a man named Agag. And so you see, the Agagites took their name from that Amalekite king whom Saul didn't kill, but whom Samuel did kill. And you might recall that that act of disobedience was what cost Saul his kingship, which should serve as a reminder to all of us that when God tells you to do something, you'd better do it, because he always has a reason for his commands. Well, in verse 2, we're told that all the officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Now, it's unlikely that Mordecai could have sat at the king's gate if he had refused to kneel before Xerxes. In addition to that, we know that there are some examples of God's people bowing down before a king or other superior. And so the most probable reason for Mordecai not bowing down before Haman was his pride as a Jew. You see, no self-respecting Benjaminite, as Mordecai was, would bow before a descendant of their ancient enemy. Well, word of Mordecai's rebellious behavior got back to Haman, and he was enraged, to say the least. But instead of looking for a way to punish just Mordecai, Haman hatched a plot to destroy all of Mordecai's people, that is, all of the Jews in the entire Persian Empire. You see, for 500 years, the Agagites had passed down this burning hatred for the Jews from one generation to the next. Apparently, they had become experts at teaching their children prejudice and bigotry, much as the radical Muslims do today towards the Jewish people. But that should remind us that no one is born with prejudice, right? Prejudice is not a package deal that comes with birth. It's something we learn, and it's something we teach. Well, it's clear that Haman had learned his lessons well, because just like his ancestors, he hated the Jews. And just like Adolf Hitler 25 centuries later, he plotted to exterminate them. And this was his plan. You see, at the beginning of each new year, the king would cast lots, which in the Persian language was called pur, P-U-R, to see which day of the year would be his lucky day. So he kind of rolls the dice and say, which day is going to be my lucky day? Well, when the lots were cast, at the beginning of the 12th year of Xerxes' reign, they fell on the 13th day of the 12th month. And when this happened, according to verses 8 and 9, it says that Haman said to the king, there is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. In other words, Haman told Xerxes, if you really want Lady Luck to smile on you, then on this day that the pur has selected, there's only one thing that you should do. Get rid of those Jews once and for all. Which just goes to show that when your life is driven by superstition, whether it be astrology or fortune tellers or Ouija boards or the Psychic Friends Network, you will always come up with ridiculous, dangerous, and even demonic ideas and decisions, as was the case here. Well, Xerxes loved Haman's idea because it appealed to his superstition and it appealed to his greed. You see, 10,000 talents of silver was the equivalent of 375 tons. And at $18 an ounce, which is the value of silver today, that comes to a whopping $216 million. Interestingly, it says later on in the text that Xerxes declined that. Anyways, Xerxes gladly gave Haman his signet ring, which contained the official seal. And Haman used that ring to send out the order to exterminate the Jews. By the way, this was another one of those laws of the Medes and the Persians that could not be rescinded. The law said that on the 13th day of the last month of the year, all of the Jews, including women and little children, were to be killed. So now it was just a matter of time. Well, Esther was secluded in the palace and unaware of what had happened, so her uncle Mordecai, or her cousin Mordecai, got word to her and asked her to intercede with the king. But Esther hesitated, and with good reason. You see, anyone who approached the king in the inner court without first being summoned would be instantly put to death. The only exception to this would be for the king to extend his scepter as a gesture of acceptance. So you didn't know. If you walked in, if he extends your scepter, you get to live. If he doesn't, you're dead. And then the king hadn't summoned Esther for over 30 days. So it was unlikely that she would be spared if she went to see him. Now, after Esther's hesitation, we see in chapter 4, verses 13 through 16, which is really the pivotal point of this whole book, Mordecai sends back this answer to Esther. He said, do not think that because you are in the king's house, basically just because you're the queen, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. Well, apparently Esther saw the gravity of her situation, and she was able to put the fate of her people ahead of her own personal safety. And so she sent this reply to Mordecai. Look at verse 16. Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day, and I and my maids will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, and even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Now this is where Esther showed her true self. You see, she was more than just a beauty queen. Xerxes may have chosen Esther because of her looks, but what he got was a woman who wasn't afraid to fight for what she knew was right. Now that reminds me of something very strange that happened back in 1993. A group of activists known as the Barbie Liberation Organization, that's really the name, the BLO, Barbie Liberation Organization, they were troubled by gender stereotypes in dolls. And so they acquired 300 talking Barbie dolls and G.I. Joe dolls, and they swapped their voice boxes. Then they put them back on the store shelves. So on Christmas morning, 1993, a lot of little boys and girls got very confused because when they pulled a string on their G.I. Joe, it would say, I love shopping. Will we ever have enough clothes? And then they'd pull Barbie's string and she would say, hit the ground, now, 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 and vengeance is mine. That really happened. You can look it up. I'd encourage you. There's a long story behind it. Well, that's essentially what had happened with Esther. Because at this point in the story, we see that Esther is so much more like G.I. Joe than Barbie because she was showing true courage. She finally understood that she was not brought to this royal position to accumulate exquisite wardrobes and precious jewels and exotic fragrances. God's providence had been at work in her life, and now was her opportunity to do what God had prepared her to do. And so she asked Mordecai to gather the Jews for a serious 3-day fast, no food or water during the entire time. And she pledged to do the same. In other words, she prepared herself spiritually for the task at hand. She prepared herself. Then, armed with the courage that only time alone with God can give, she put on her royal robes and she went to the king, to the inner court, and waited for Xerxes to see her. Now just imagine what must have been running through her mind as she waited. Is this going to be life or death? Will the king welcome me, or will I be immediately killed by one of his soldiers? Well, we see in chapter 5, verse 2, that the king was pleased to see Esther. And so he held out his golden scepter to show that he had accepted her. So she would live, at least for the moment. Now in verse 3 of chapter 5, Xerxes says, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Wow. See, an offer like that would seem that Esther had it made. I mean, all she had to say was, "Xerxes, dear, would you please, pretty please, revoke the unalterable law of the Medes and the Persians and then execute your chief of staff, please?" But we have to understand that Xerxes' offer was really an exaggeration. It was basically king talk. What he was really saying was something like, "I'm in a good mood today, sweetie, so what can I do for you?" And Esther understood that. So instead of making her request, she wisely said, "I'm hosting a banquet, and I'd like for you and Haman to come." Well, we already know that Xerxes loved banquets, and so he gladly agreed. Later on, when they were at the banquet, as we see in verse 6, he again said to Esther, "Now what is your petition? It will be given you, and what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Now, why doesn't she just jump on this? Well, you see, Esther showed her shrewd wisdom. Look at what she says in verse 7 and verse 8. She says, "My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question." In other words, tomorrow, at the next party, I'll tell you what it is that I want. You see, Esther had been so skillful in all of this that the king had pretty much already agreed to her request even before he heard it. An amazing act of boldness and wisdom on her part, which once again shows us that her beauty was so much more than skin deep. Well, after that first banquet, Haman headed home. And on his way home, people were bowing to him left and right as they always did. But then he encountered Mordecai, who once again refused to bow down, and that just ruined Haman's day. And so when he got home, he moped around the house and told his wife, "I've got all this going for me. I'm number 2 in the kingdom. I'm tremendously wealthy. In fact, I've just come from a private banquet with the king and the queen, and they've invited me back tomorrow for another banquet. But all this does me no good as long as that Jew, Mordecai, is sitting at the king's gate and refusing to bow down before me." Well, his loving wife suggested that he'd feel better if he built a gallows and had Mordecai impaled on it. It's a nice wife, right? Well, that idea immediately brightened Haman's mood. And so he instructed some workers to build a gallows 75 feet high for just that purpose. And they got to work immediately, working all night long on the project, constructing perhaps the largest gallows ever built. Well, that same night, the king, King Xerxes, he couldn't sleep, probably because of all the hammering and sawing going on over at Haman's house. And so he woke his servants and he ordered them to read to him. And they just happened to select, now listen carefully to the words I'm using here, they just happened to select a real sleep-inducing book, The Annals of the King. But coincidentally, they began to read the chapter that told of the time that Mordecai saved the king from assassination. Well, when they came to that part, Xerxes asked if Mordecai had ever been honored for this brave act. And they said, "Well, no, he hasn't." So Xerxes decided to do something about it. Otherwise, it would be a blot on his kingly payback record. Now, by this time, it was early in the morning, and the king asked, "Well, who's in the court?" And Haman was there bright and early to ask permission to use the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So Haman was brought in, and the king said to him in chapter 6, verse 6, "I need to pick your brain about something, Haman. What shall be done for the man to whom the king wishes to honor?" What shall be done for the man to whom the king wishes to honor? And here's where the book gets really good. To get the full effect, picture this like a play. And Haman is now doing an aside just to the audience, so the king can't hear him. And so he whispers to us, who would the king wish to honor more than me? So I'd better make this really good because I basically get to write my own check. So Haman turned to the king and said, if you really want to honor someone, then let him wear one of your royal robes and crowns and sit on one of your horses and have someone parade him through the streets saying, this is how someone whom the king honors is treated. Well, the king thought that was a great idea, so he said to Haman in verse 10, go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you suggested for Mordecai the Jew. Talk about humiliation, talk about embarrassment. In fact, you can almost feel the anger and the rage just jumping off the page. But Haman had to keep his cool and do as the king commanded, because when a king gives an order, you have to obey. So that's exactly what he did. Well, that night, Esther hosted her second banquet, and Haman probably sat there just picking at his food because he just spent the whole day honoring his sworn enemy. But at least the king had a good time, and once again he said to Esther, okay, you've been fattening me up long enough, so what's your request? Even half the kingdom. So Esther, with the amazing wisdom and boldness that only comes from utter dependence on God, informed the king that she and her people were about to be destroyed. The king said, what? By whom? And here again she showed her daring, because she didn't blink an eye as she replied in chapter 7, verse 6, that the adversary and enemy is this vile Haman. By the way, did you know that when the Jews celebrate this festival, when they read the entire book of Esther, every time the name Haman is said, people stomp their feet and they go, boo! Don't do that now. But just so, if you ever attend a Purim celebration, you'll know what it's about. Well, hearing that, I mean, this vile Haman, the king got up in a rage. He stomped out on the balcony. He said, what am I going to do? You know, this is my second in command, and he's doing everything I don't want him to do. Well, while he was out there, Haman threw himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, begging her for mercy. But then the king unexpectedly walked back into the room and saw Haman on the couch with Esther, and he said, will you even molest my queen? Well, at this point, one of the king's yes men stepped up and he said, you know, Xerxes is a gallows 75 feet high outside that Haman had built for Mordecai. So without batting an eye, the king said, hang Haman on it. And that's exactly what they did. And with that in mind, Proverbs 11, verse 8 comes to mind. It says, the righteous man is rescued from trouble, and it comes on the wicked instead. It's exactly what happened with Haman. Well, after Haman is executed, kind of in a very appropriate way, his estate is given to Mordecai, and then Mordecai is given the number 2 position in the kingdom to replace him. And whereas the edict commanding the destruction of the Jews could not be rescinded, Xerxes consented to another edict giving the Jews the right to defend themselves. And you should read those chapters if you get a chance. Did they ever defend themselves? Because when the 13th day of the 12th month rolled around, chapter 9, verse 2 says that no one could stand against the Jews. So instead of that day being a day of mourning and tragedy, it turned out to be a day of rejoicing and celebration. And to this very day, the Jewish people celebrate this event every February or March, depending on how the Jewish calendar is, in a festival which they call Purim, based on the Persian word pur, which, remember, means lots. Now, there's a great deal that we can learn from the adventures of this woman, Esther. In fact, it would be very easy to preach an entire series from the book of Esther, but with the time remaining, I want to point out just 2 powerful truths for us to take home with us today. And the first is this: God is at work in our lives even when we can't see him at work. Amen? God is at work in our lives even when we can't see him. Scholars have pointed out that God's name is not even mentioned in this book. Did you know that? Not even mentioned once. God's name is not here, but his sovereign actions are everywhere. I love the way Bible commentator Matthew Henry puts it. He says, though the name of God be not in Esther, the finger of God is directing many minute events for the bringing about of his people's deliverance. You see, God was obviously acting behind the scenes of this story through a number of seeming coincidences. Let's review some. Esther being chosen as queen over all the other 126 beautiful candidates. Mordecai discovering the plot to kill the Jews, to kill the king. The casting of lots for the day to kill the Jews, resulting in a date late in the year which gave Mordecai and Esther time to act. By the way, that particular kind of coincidence reminds us of Proverbs 16, verse 33, which says, the lot, the pur, is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. Another example of God's working behind the scenes was the king's enthusiastic welcome of Esther after ignoring her for a month, as was his patience with Esther in permitting her to hold 2 banquets before she made her request. And what about the king's insomnia that brought to light Mordecai's deed of kindness, or the king's apparent lapse of memory that led him to honor Mordecai, one of the very Jews that he had agreed to slay? Now we could go on and on listing unexplainable events that in hindsight reveal that activity of God, but what we need to realize is that these crucial, pivotal parts of the story are not just coincidences. They are God at work. That's why someone has defined coincidence as a miracle for which God chooses to remain anonymous. And that's certainly seen in this book. You know, all too often, even as Christians, we think that God is absent in our lives, that he's not involved, because miracles seem so rare these days. But Esther's story shows us that God is just as active in the mundane things of life as he is in the miracles. Amen? He's just as active in the mundane things, the everyday. He's behind the scenes, directing every day of our life, directing things according to his perfect will, which will always be for our good. And so God may be invisible, but he is also invincible. He's present in every scene and every movement of our daily life. It's just that we don't always see it. You know, I've heard that human beings can only see about 30% of the light spectrum, whereas creatures like honeybees and homing pigeons can detect ultraviolet light waves that are invisible to us. But in the spiritual realm, our vision is even more limited because we only get to see occasional glimpses of that unseen world. And so it follows that just because we're unable to see the activity of God, that doesn't mean that he's not active. And so if you ever feel that God is silent or hidden in your life, maybe you're feeling like that this morning, then remember Esther's story along with what we read in 2 Corinthians 5, verse 7, where it says, we live by faith, not by sight. My friends, we should never doubt the presence and the activity of God in our lives, whether we see it or not. That's the first thing we can learn from the story. The second thing the story teaches us is the impact that one person can have in fulfilling the purposes of God. Look at what one young woman was able to do. God used her to save the Jewish people from annihilation. And we need to pay attention to that amazing truth because in our overpopulated, mass media-driven world, it's so easy to underestimate the power of the individual. All too often we wonder, what can we alone contribute to the overwhelming needs of our world? But as the book of Esther illustrates, one person can make a huge difference. Author Edward Everett Hale put it like this. He said, I am only one, but I am still one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse the something that I can do. You know, as we read through God's Word, we don't find many stories about God using a mass or a throng of people to do his will. Instead, from Genesis to Revelation, we see God's hand on the lives of individuals who made history because they did what was right, regardless of the outcome. And even today, God is looking for a few good men and women who will stand up for his truth. 2 Chronicles 16:9 says, for the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth. Why? To strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. God is looking for those who are fully committed. So I'm going to strengthen you to do what I want you to do. This little book of the Bible records that God mightily used one woman who was willing to take a stand. And my friends, God will use you if you will take a stand for him. And so think of where you work. Think of where you live. Think of where you shop and so on, right on down the line. And then remember that it's no accident that you are where you are, right? Ask yourself the same question that Mordecai asked Esther. Who knows but that you, one individual, have come to this position for such a time as this? Let's pray together. Father in heaven, we